The Thanksgiving turkey smelled of sage and pure hypocrisy. My Aunt Brenda smiled, swirling her expensive wine. We finally sold Walter's Bakery yesterday. You were never in the trust anyway. So, let's not make a scene. My cousin laughed into her napkin. Good, she'd just ruined the property with her boring bread. 12 faces turned to watch me break. I didn't. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, placed my glass down, and smiled back. That's wonderful. I hope you enjoy the cash, since my company is the one who bought it. The entire table went dead silent. Before we continue, drop a comment telling me where and when you're watching this story. I have to take you back 2 weeks before that dinner. I was sitting in my car, parked 2 blocks away from the historic bakery that bore my grandfather Walter's name, my phone screen lit up in the dark cabin. It was an email from my bank confirming that a wire transfer of $520,000 had successfully cleared the escrow account. The public auction was officially closed. The deed was secured. I did not scream. I did not hit the steering wheel in triumph or burst into tears of joy. I just sat there, listening to the quiet hum of my engine, feeling the cold leather of the steering wheel beneath my calloused hands. Those calluses were earned over 8 long years, while other women my age were building their portfolios in shiny office buildings. I was waking up at 4 a.m. to the smell of yeast and warm butter. I was the one who kept Walter's legacy alive when his health began to fail. I was the one who scrubbed the industrial ovens until my knuckles bled. When the property taxes came due every winter to the tune of $14,000, Brenda did not open her designer purse. Gary did not offer a dime from his real estate commissions. Megan simply complained that the bakery did not serve trendy matcha lattes. I paid those taxes out of my own modest savings. When the main dough mixer broke down right before the holiday rush, costing $3,200 to fix, I did not take a salary for 3 months to cover the repair. I did all of this quietly, keeping the ledgers balanced and the display cases full. Brenda would only visit twice a year, usually stepping around the flour on the floor in her expensive heels, just to open the cash register and take a handful of bills for a manicure. She thought my silence meant I was weak. She thought a woman covered in flour was incapable of understanding a balance sheet. People who only value easy money often underestimate the people who know how to work for it. They mistake patience for submission. They assume that if you are not yelling, you are not fighting. I let them believe that. I let them think I was nothing more than the obedient granddaughter who was good for nothing but shaping loaves of bread. But as I stared at the escrow confirmation on my phone that night, I felt a deep, steady rhythm in my chest. It was the rhythm of a ledger finally balancing out. I turned off the car engine and stepped out into the crisp Boston air. I had a bakery to run. To understand why Brenda and Gary wanted to sell the bakery so desperately, you have to understand the neighborhood. Walter had opened his shop on a quiet, cobblestone street in Boston 4 decades ago. Back then, it was a modest area filled with family-owned hardware stores and local diners. But cities change. Over the last 5 years, gentrification had swept through the district like a relentless tide. The old diners were torn down to make way for high-rise luxury apartments. The hardware stores were replaced by expensive fusion restaurants with rooftop dining. The ground beneath Walter's Bakery was no longer just dirt and stone. It was prime, highly coveted real estate. The official appraisal listed the property at $450,000, which was a decent sum. But Gary was a commercial real estate broker. He knew the zoning laws were about to be rewritten by the city council. Once that building was rezoned for multi-story development, the plot would be worth at least $1,600,000. Gary did not care about the smell of sourdough or the loyal customers who had been buying Walter's pastries for 30 years. He only saw square footage and commission checks. During Walter's final year, Gary started dropping by the bakery more often. He would stand in the middle of the customer area, wearing his sharp grey suits, tapping the old exposed brick walls with his knuckles. He would speak loudly on his phone to property developers, completely ignoring the customers trying to enjoy their coffee. "The foundation is solid, but the structure is a dump," Gary said one afternoon, taking a bite of a cinnamon roll he did not pay for. "We can level this in a week, build a 6-story complex, retail on the bottom, penthouses on top." He said this while I was standing right behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine. He wanted me to hear it. He wanted to establish dominance, to remind me that I was just an employee in a building he intended to liquidate. Brenda fully supported him. She already had her eyes on a vacation home in Florida, and Megan was demanding capital to start a boutique clothing brand that was doomed to fail. They saw Walter's life work as nothing more than an ATM waiting to be smashed open. They had zero respect for the heritage of the place, and even less respect for me. But I did not argue with Gary when he measured the floor space. I did not ask him to lower his voice. I just offered him a napkin for the crumbs on his expensive suit and memorized every single word he said to his developers. The bricks heard everything. Behind the main baking station, tucked into a shadowed corner of the kitchen, sat a massive stainless steel dough proofer. It was an industrial proofing cabinet from the 1980s, heavy and dented, with a thick glass door that had grown cloudy with age. While I systematically upgraded the ovens and the espresso machines over the years to keep the business efficient, Walter adamantly refused to let anyone touch that old proofer. "It controls the humidity perfectly," he would say, running his hand along the scarred metal. "The most important thing in a kitchen isn't always used for baking. Collins, remember that?" I always thought it was just the sentimental attachment of an old baker. But things started to feel strange in the weeks leading up to the public auction. Brenda, who rarely stepped foot in the kitchen because she hated the smell of yeast, suddenly developed an intense interest in the equipment. She stood in the doorway one morning, her arms crossed, eyeing the heavy cabinet. "When are we trashing that metal monstrosity?" Brenda asked, her eyes narrowing. "It is taking up valuable floor space. The liquidation company said they won't even pay scrap value for it." 2 days later, Gary pulled me aside and offered to have his moving crew haul the proofer away. He even offered to give me $500 out of his own pocket if I let him scrap it before the auction. Gary never gave away money unless it benefited him tenfold. His sudden generosity was a massive red flag. That night, after I locked the front doors and flipped the sign to closed, I walked to the back of the kitchen. I stood in front of the old proofer, staring at its dull metal casing. I ran my fingers along the side panels, tracing the seams where the metal plates met. It was covered in decades of flour dust and dried grease. But as my hand reached the lower back panel, my fingers brushed against something out of place. I crouched down and aimed my phone's flashlight at the bottom corner. There, securing the bottom plate, were 4 screws, 3 of them were rusted, stripped, and covered in grime. But the 4th screw, located in the bottom right corner, was shiny and new. The metal threads were completely pristine, as if it had been installed very recently. Walter's voice echoed in my head. The most important thing in a kitchen isn't always used for baking. I did not have a screwdriver with me that night. I did not try to pry the panel open with a butter knife. I just turned off my flashlight, stood up, and wiped the flour from my apron. Whatever Walter had hidden behind that shiny new screw, it was making Brenda and Gary very nervous. I decided to leave it untouched. For now, I knew how to wait. People often ask me why I stayed quiet for so long. They wonder why a grown woman running a profitable business would let her aunt and uncle treat her like a disposable servant. They do not understand the invisible chain that binds a survivor. When Walter's health rapidly declined, Brenda immediately took control of his medical care. She moved him into a specialized facility and appointed herself as the sole gatekeeper to his hospital room. If I wanted to see my grandfather, I had to go through Brenda. If I raised my voice, if I demanded respect, or if I challenged her authority, she would simply revoke my visiting privileges. She held the one thing I cared about, hostage. So, I learned to swallow my pride. I learned to nod respectfully when she insulted my clothes. I learned to clean up the messes Megan made when she brought her friends into the bakery after hours. I normalized the abuse because it was the only way to ensure I could sit by Walter's bedside and hold his frail hand on Sunday afternoons. Brenda played the role of the devoted, exhausted daughter perfectly. She would sigh loudly in the hospital corridors, telling the nurses how much she sacrificed to coordinate his care. She painted me as the distant, work-obsessed granddaughter who only cared about selling bread. I let her spin her narrative. I focused on making sure Walter was comfortable, bringing him his favorite soft pastries that he could easily eat. But the facade of the loving daughter was just a smokescreen for a much darker reality. Months later, when I finally gained access to the bakery's internal financial records, I found the truth buried in the bank statements. While I was working 14-hour shifts to keep the lights on and pay the vendors, Brenda was quietly draining Walter's personal checking account. Every single month, on the first day of the month, a transaction was processed. $8,000 transferred directly into Brenda's private account. The memo line simply read, "Caregiving fees." She was charging her own dying father a premium salary to visit him twice a week and complain about the hospital coffee. She was bleeding him dry while standing in the waiting room, demanding sympathy from strangers. Finding those statements did not make me cry. It did not make me want to call her and scream into the phone. It simply flipped a switch inside my mind. It killed any lingering guilt I might have felt about what I was going to do to them. The woman who demanded $8,000 a month for basic human decency was not a family member. She was a parasite. I filed the bank statements in a secure digital folder. Math has no emotions. The night Walter passed away, the sky over Boston was pouring freezing rain. I was sitting by his bed when the monitor flatlined. The grief was a heavy, suffocating weight, but I did not have the luxury of falling apart. Within 2 hours of his passing, Brenda was already making calls, changing the locks on Walter's apartment, and taking inventory of his belongings. By midnight, I was back at the bakery. I needed the familiarity of the flour and the warmth of the ovens to ground myself. When I pushed open the back door, I found Henderson, our 65-year-old head baker, packing his personal knives into a canvas roll. His white apron was draped over a chair. He had worked alongside Walter for 30 years. He was the heart of the kitchen. "What are you doing, Henderson?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his eyes tired and sad. "Brenda called 10 minutes ago. She fired me. Said I ruined a batch of sourdough this morning and cost the business money. Told me if I was not gone by sunrise, she would call the police. It was a blatant lie. Henderson had not ruined a single batch of dough in a decade." I walked over and gently pushed the canvas roll down. "You are not leaving," I said. "This is your kitchen." Henderson shook his head slowly. "It is not about the bread, Collins. Brenda is cleaning house. She wants me gone before the lawyers get involved." He sat down on a stool, wiping flour from his weathered hands. He looked at the old dough proofer in the corner, then back to me. 2 years ago, Walter asked me to stay late. Everyone else had gone home. A man in a dark suit came through the back door, a lawyer. Walter brought him into the small office and asked me to stand by the door. I pulled up a chair and sat across from him, listening intently. Walter had me sign a document as a witness. Henderson continued. He wanted me to testify that he was completely lucid, that he was not being coerced. Walter looked at me and said, "I am protecting the bakery. Henderson, Brenda and Gary will try to pave over it when I am gone. I am making sure they cannot." I never read the document, Collins. But I saw the envelope. It was from a corporate law firm downtown. Brenda must have found out about that meeting. She realized Henderson was a loose end, a witness who could testify to Walter's sound state of mind. She fired him in the middle of the night to silence him and cut off my only ally in the building. I stood up, walked over to the coffee machine, and poured us both a cup. I handed one to Henderson. "Go home and rest," I told him calmly. "Consider this a paid vacation. I will call you when it is time to turn the ovens back on." He nodded, taking the coffee. The war had officially started. The funeral service was a brief, sterile affair. Brenda wore black cashmere and accepted condolences from the neighborhood like a grieving monarch. Gary checked his gold watch twice during the eulogy. Megan spent the reception complaining about the lack of cellular service in the church. I stood by the door, thanking the regular customers who had loved Walter for decades. I did not shed a tear in front of them. Grief is a private matter, and I refused to give my family the satisfaction of seeing me break. Less than an hour after the last guest left, they cornered me in the cramped bakery office. Gary placed a thick manila folder on the wooden desk. He did not offer a word of comfort. "We need to talk about the liquidation," Gary said smoothly. He slid a single, crisp piece of paper across the desk. It was a power of attorney. The document explicitly granted Brenda full administrative control over Walter's assets, including the immediate sale of the bakery property. Brenda wiped a perfectly dry eye and claimed it was exactly what Walter wanted in his final days. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse them of lying. I simply picked up the paper and read it. I read it the way I analyze quarterly tax filings, scanning for discrepancies in the margins. The date typed on the signature line was October 14th. I remembered that specific Tuesday perfectly. It was the exact day the palliative care team had placed Walter on a heavy, continuous dose of intravenous sedatives. He could not even hold a small paper cup of water that afternoon, let alone grip a ballpoint pen with such firm, deliberate pressure. I moved my eyes to the notary seal stamped near the bottom edge. It belonged to a man named Arthur Vance. I knew Arthur well. He used to buy our day-old sourdough every Friday. Arthur had retired and moved to a cabin in Maine 3 full months before the date stamped on this paper. Then, I examined the signature itself. It was undeniably Walter's handwriting, but it was far too perfect. Every loop, every sharp angle, and every cross matched exactly with the signature on a bakery expansion loan we had taken out 5 years ago. It was a digital scan, lazily layered onto a new text document. The black ink did not bleed naturally into the fibers of the paper. It sat flat and lifeless on the surface. The final mistake was the most glaring. The document listed the property to be liquidated as Walter's Historic Bakery. That was just the painted sign above our front door. The actual legal name registered on the county deed was Walter Family Commercial Holdings. A legitimate estate lawyer would never make a foundational error like that. Gary had clearly drafted this forgery himself, likely using the laser printer sitting in his own real estate office. They were attempting to steal a $500,000 building with a cheap parlor trick. I did not point out the errors. If I played my hand too early, Gary would simply print a better forgery. I gently placed the paper back on the desk and slid it toward Brenda. "I understand," I said evenly. Gary smirked, visibly relaxing his shoulders. He thought he had easily crushed the quiet baker. The trap was set. The following morning, I arrived at the bakery hours before dawn. The building felt incredibly hollow without the familiar sound of Henderson firing up the massive stone ovens. As I sat in the dim light of the back office, sorting through the final stack of incoming mail, I noticed a thick, premium envelope addressed to Brenda. It bore the return address of a corporate acquisitions firm representing a rapidly expanding national coffee chain. Brenda had carelessly used the bakery as her primary mailing address for the transaction, likely assuming the quiet baker would never dare open her personal mail. I did not hesitate. I slid a letter opener through the seal. Inside was a fully executed commercial licensing agreement. Brenda had not just authorized the sale of the physical bricks and the land, she had systematically sold the very soul of the business. The contract clearly outlined the transfer of our classic storefront logo, our entire customer mailing list, and most devastatingly, Walter's proprietary baking recipes. The living sourdough starter that Walter had carefully cultivated and fed for over 30 years was casually listed as a transferable asset. In exchange for handing over our family heritage, Brenda had secured an upfront cash payment of $75,000. I quickly cross-referenced the dates on the contract. The corporate wire transfer had cleared the bank exactly 3 days before Megan suddenly paid off her massive credit card debts and flaunted a brand new designer wardrobe on her social media accounts. Brenda had literally sold my grandfather's life work to fund her daughter's superficial shopping spree. The corporate coffee chain planned to market their frozen, mass-produced pastries as the official continuation of Walter's historic tradition. It was a complete desecration of everything we stood for. The local community was already buzzing with conflicting rumors. Many older neighbors were heartbroken about losing a beloved historic landmark, while newer residents were eagerly buying into Gary's false narrative that a luxury apartment development would naturally increase local property values. Brenda was walking around the neighborhood daily, playing the role of the tragic, exhausted daughter who was simply forced to liquidate a failing business. She had absolutely no idea that I was sitting in the dark, holding the exact contract that proved her boundless greed. I did not call her to demand an explanation. I did not leave an angry voicemail. I simply walked over to the office scanner and made 3 high-quality, color copies of the licensing agreement. I folded the original document, placed it back into the envelope, resealed the flap with a tiny dab of clear glue, and left it on the edge of the desk exactly where I had found it. Let her believe she was a brilliant negotiator. Let her spend that $75,000 on frivolous luxuries she could not afford. I knew something she did not. You cannot legally sell intellectual property that you do not actually own. I locked the copied documents safely inside my briefcase. The ovens remained perfectly cold. Gary was a man who deeply worshipped his own perceived intelligence. He genuinely believed he was always the smartest person in any room, especially when that room included his quiet, flower-covered niece. The public estate auction for the bakery property was formally scheduled to take place in a few short weeks. The minimum reserve price had been set artificially low at $400,000 to guarantee a rapid, uncontested sale. Brenda just wanted quick cash to fund her impending Florida retirement. But Gary was playing a much longer, far more lucrative game. I knew Gary's standard business tactics, so I began to quietly dig into the public commercial registry. It took me 3 long nights of scrolling through dull municipal databases, matching incorporation dates, and cross-referencing registered corporate agents before I finally found the anomaly. A new limited liability company had been incorporated exactly 5 days after Walter passed away. The entity was ambiguously named Harbor Horizon Developments. On paper, it looked perfectly legal, resembling a generic, faceless investment firm from out of state. But Gary was inherently lazy. He had registered the shell company using the exact same physical office address as his own real estate brokerage downtown. Furthermore, the state incorporation filing fee of $500 had been paid using a corporate credit card ending in 4 specific digits. I recognized those numbers immediately. They matched the shiny platinum card Gary carelessly used to buy expensive coffees every single morning at my counter. His master plan was embarrassingly transparent. Gary intended to use Harbor Horizon to officially win the bakery at the public auction, likely stopping his bids around $480,000. Brenda would happily take her cut, completely unaware that she was being severely shortchanged. Once his shell company legally owned the deed, Gary would simply hold the property for a few months until the city council officially approved the new luxury zoning laws. Then, he would quickly flip the historic building directly to his wealthy corporate developers for a staggering $1,600,000. He was not just stealing from me. He was actively orchestrating a massive, multi-layered fraud to cheat his own sister out of over $1 million in pure profit. Gary planned to pocket the massive difference entirely for himself, leaving Brenda with pennies on the dollar while she thought she had won. I sat at my small kitchen table, reviewing the printed registry documents under the warm yellow light of my pendant lamp. My family was a nest of vipers, eagerly preparing to devour each other for a larger piece of Walter's legacy. I carefully filed the incorporation records into my growing leather folder of evidence. Gary firmly believed he was setting an inescapable trap for the rest of us. He had absolutely no idea he was just meticulously weaving the rope for his own professional execution. I poured myself a glass of cold water and watched the empty city streets below. I let them dig deeper. Exactly a week before the scheduled auction, I made one final deliberate attempt to reach out to them. I did not do this because I naively thought they would suddenly grow a conscience, but because I needed to give them one last opportunity to do the right thing. I wanted their refusal firmly on the record of my own mind. I invited Brenda and Gary to the bakery for a morning cup of coffee. They arrived late, looking deeply inconvenienced by the request. I sat across from them at a small wooden table near the front window. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing in the air. I laid out a simple, entirely logical proposal. I offered to buy them out of their assumed shares gradually over 5 years, keeping the bakery fully operational and ensuring Henderson and the other staff kept their livelihoods. I calmly explained how much the local community relied on the business and how Walter would have wanted the ovens to stay warm. Brenda scoffed loudly, waving her manicured hand in the air as if batting away an annoying insect. "Collins, please be realistic," she said, admiring her own reflection in the window glass. "We are not running a neighborhood charity. This building is a veritable gold mine, and you are just a baker. You really do not understand how real corporate capital works." Gary leaned forward, resting his tailored elbows on the wooden table. He offered me a deeply patronizing smile, the kind reserved for foolish children. "Listen to me, kid. You had a really good run playing shopkeeper all these years. But the adults are making the financial decisions now. The public auction happens next Friday. Rain or shine, you need to pack up your aprons and find a new hobby." They did not ask how I would make a living going forward. They did not ask what would happen to the loyal employees who had served our family for decades. Megan, who had tagged along just to use the espresso machine, did not even look up from her phone. They looked at me and saw nothing but a minor obstacle they believed they had already easily paved over. I did not beg for their mercy. I did not remind them of the thousands of unpaid hours I had worked to keep the business afloat, while they ignored Walter's decline. I simply looked at their smug, confident faces and quietly accepted their final answer. I stood up, gathered their empty coffee cups, and carried them toward the kitchen sink. They thought I was retreating in absolute defeat. They thought my quiet demeanor was the white flag of surrender. They walked out of the heavy glass door, laughing loudly about their upcoming dinner reservations, leaving me alone in the silent shop. I pulled out my phone and called the commercial lender I had been secretly corresponding with for weeks. It was time to finalize the heavy numbers. They had made their cruel choice with absolute clarity. Now, I was entirely free to make mine without a single ounce of hesitation. My conscience was completely clear. People love the comforting idea of a miraculous windfall. They want to believe that true justice is magically funded by a sudden lottery win or a hidden treasure chest discovered at the 11th hour. But reality is rarely that poetic. Reality is built on compound interest, strict budgets, and aggressive financial leverage. To beat a seasoned broker like Gary at his own game, I needed cold, hard capital. I needed over $500,000 to confidently outbid his shell company and secure the commercial deed. I did not have a wealthy benefactor waiting in the wings. I only had my own meticulous ledgers. For 8 years, I had lived incredibly frugally. I rarely bought new clothes. I drove a reliable 10-year-old sedan, and I saved every single extra dollar the bakery paid me. That intense discipline resulted in exactly $130,000 in personal savings. It was a strong foundation, but not nearly enough to win a bidding war. So, I took the next logical step without a hint of sentimentality. I quickly sold my small, one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, moving my few belongings into a tiny rented room above a noisy laundromat. That immediate sacrifice injected another $90,000 in liquid cash directly into my war chest. Next, I approached a commercial bank downtown because I had personally managed the bakery's daily books so flawlessly, showing consistent year-over-year revenue despite the aggressive neighborhood changes. I easily qualified for a commercial business loan. They approved $150,000, secured tightly against the projected future revenue of the shop. I was now sitting at $370,000. I needed more to comfortably crush Gary's calculated maximum limit. I quietly reached out to a small, private group of local neighborhood investors, business owners who despised the rapid corporate gentrification and desperately wanted to preserve the historic character of our street. They reviewed my airtight business plan and collectively contributed $100,000 in exchange for a minor, silent equity stake. Finally, I leveraged my flawless payment history with our primary flour and sugar suppliers. Based on a decade of trust, they extended a commercial credit line of $50,000 to cover my immediate operational costs post-auction. $130,000, $90,000, $150,000, $100,000, $50,000. I sat at my laptop late into the night, staring at the final tally on my glowing spreadsheet. $520,000. It was an absolute mountain of capital, painstakingly assembled dollar by dollar, favor by favor, sacrifice by sacrifice. There was no magic involved in this impending victory. It was purely the undeniable result of 8 years of unseen labor culminating in one highly aggressive financial strike. I transferred the funds into a consolidated holding account, watching the digital numbers align perfectly on the banking screen. The trap was fully funded and ready to snap shut. The math favored the baker. I did not walk into the crowded county auction house myself. That would have been a catastrophic strategic error. If Brenda or Gary saw me holding a bidding paddle, they would have immediately suspected I had access to capital. Gary might have acted irrationally, pushing his bids to dangerous levels just to outbid me out of pure spite. Instead, I operated entirely through the invisible legal shield I had constructed 6 months earlier. Back when Brenda first started asking suspicious questions about property values, I had quietly hired a registered corporate agent to form a limited liability company. I named it Iron Crust Holdings. On all public county records, only the corporate name and the agent's downtown address appeared. My identity as the sole proprietor was safely shielded behind strict corporate privacy regulations. On the cold morning of the auction, I sat comfortably in my car 2 blocks away, sipping a black coffee, watching the live digital bidding portal on my tablet. I had hired a calm, professional proxy bidder to sit in the room on behalf of Iron Crust Holdings. He had incredibly strict instructions and a hard, non-negotiable maximum limit. The auction began promptly at 9 a.m. The opening ask was exactly $400,000. Immediately, a representative for Gary's shell company, Harbor Horizon, raised his paddle. The price climbed in sharp, rapid increments. $420,000. $450,000. Gary's proxy was bidding aggressively, clearly trying to intimidate the rest of the room. But my proxy simply nodded his head, raising the price calmly, treating the massive sums of money like a casual, everyday transaction at $480,000. Gary's proxy suddenly hesitated. He looked down anxiously at his phone. I knew exactly what was happening in that moment. Gary had likely structured his short-term financing to max out just below $500,000, absolutely certain that no local buyer would push higher for an aging bakery. He did not have the immediate liquidity to cross the $500,000 mark without exposing his own personal assets to massive risk. My proxy raised his paddle one final time. $520,000. The auction room fell into a heavy, unbroken silence. The auctioneer called out the final standard warnings. Going once, going twice. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down hard. Sold to Iron Crust Holdings. My phone buzzed a second later with a brief confirmation text from my proxy. The massive sum of money was immediately transferred from my consolidated holding account directly into the county's secure escrow account, awaiting final legal clearance. Brenda and Gary walked out of the building a few minutes later. From my car, I could see Brenda beaming brightly, practically calculating her new Florida wardrobe in her head. Gary looked slightly irritated that his proxy failed, but I knew he would try to buy it from the new owner later. They thought they had successfully sold Walter's legacy to a faceless corporation. They had no idea they had just sold it back to me. The deed was finally mine. 2 days after the public auction successfully closed, my phone vibrated on the bakery counter. The caller ID displayed Brenda's name. I let it ring 3 times, carefully wiping down the stainless steel espresso machine, before I finally swiped the screen to answer. Her voice flowed through the speaker, dripping with an artificial, sugary warmth that immediately set my teeth on edge. Collins, darling. Brenda practically sang into the phone. I know things have been terribly tense between us lately. With Walter passing and the stressful liquidation of the property, emotions have simply run entirely too high. But it is November. Family is family. We are hosting Thanksgiving dinner next Thursday, and we would absolutely love for you to join us. I held the phone slightly away from my ear. I knew Brenda better than she knew herself. She was currently under the incredibly false impression that she had just sold the bakery to a massive corporate developer. She believed the escrow account held over $500,000 of clean, untraceable cash that she and Gary were about to split. She was victorious, and victorious narcissists always require an audience. They need the people they defeated to sit at their table and silently witness their magnificent triumph. But there was a secondary, far more calculated reason for this sudden holiday invitation. Greedy people are inherently paranoid. They constantly look over their shoulders, terrified that someone will snatch their stolen prize. Brenda wanted me in her dining room so she could legally neutralize me. She wanted to present a document, likely a family settlement or a legal waiver, and emotionally pressure me into signing it in front of the entire family. She needed me to formally forfeit any future right to contest the fraudulent power of attorney or question the rapid auction process. Megan had already posted a picture of an expensive holiday centerpiece on her social media page, captioned with a smug quote about embracing new beginnings and leaving toxic negativity in the past. They were meticulously setting a psychological stage. They wanted the quiet baker to show up, eat a slice of dry turkey, sign her rights away, and fade quietly into absolute obscurity. I looked around my quiet, empty bakery. I thought about the copies of the illegal intellectual property sale sitting safely in my briefcase. I thought about the detailed corporate records linking Gary to the shell company that tried to manipulate the auction. They were politely inviting a heavily armed adversary into their dining room, completely oblivious to the legal arsenal I possessed. I would love to come. Brenda, I said, my voice perfectly steady and polite. What can I bring for the table? She let out a relieved, entirely fake laugh. Just bring yourself, sweetheart. Let us put the past behind us and finally move forward. I will see you on Thursday, I replied smoothly. The trap was poorly hidden. After hanging up with Brenda, I locked the front doors of the bakery and retreated to the small office in the back. Walter's old wooden desk was exactly as he had left it. I needed to clear out some of his personal files before the heavy renovations began. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out his heavy, leather-bound recipe book. It was a massive volume, filled with decades of handwritten notes, ingredient ratios, and baking temperatures. As I gently flipped through the thick, flour-dusted pages, the scent of dried vanilla and old paper filled the small room. It smelled like my childhood. It smelled like safety. I turned to the section detailing his famous sourdough starter, the exact same starter Brenda had illegally sold to a corporate coffee chain. Lodged between two stained pages was a crisp, perfectly clean piece of heavy cardstock. I pulled it out. It was a professional business card for an attorney named Patricia Vance, specializing in estate planning and corporate asset protection. I ran my thumb over the embossed silver lettering. On the back of the card, written in Walter's unmistakable, sharp handwriting, was a short, cryptic sentence, "Don't open the oven too early. The right thing takes time to prove." Just below that sentence was a sequence of 4 numbers 7, 2, 4, 9. I sat back in Walter's squeaky wooden chair, staring at the numbers. Walter was not a man who played complicated games. He was a master baker. He believed in precise measurements, exact temperatures, and perfect timing. If he left a hidden message inside his most guarded recipe book, it was a deliberate, calculated instruction. He knew Brenda would never bother to look inside a book detailing hard manual labor. He knew I was the only person who would ever treat those recipes with the reverence they deserved. If you have ever found a hidden message or a quiet sign from someone who passed away, please comment, "I found it," below to let me know I am not alone in this feeling. I looked at the attorney's name again. Patricia Vance. I remembered Henderson mentioning that a corporate lawyer had visited Walter in the bakery 2 years ago, asking him to sign documents proving he was completely lucid and acting of his own free will. This business card was the breadcrumb Walter had intentionally left behind for me to find when the time was right. I typed Patricia's office number into my phone and saved it. Then I stared at the 4 digits written in blue ink. 7, 2, 4, 9. It looked like a standard PIN code. I thought about the heavy, stainless steel doors, the locked filing cabinets, and the security systems protecting the building. The numbers formed a code. I walked out of the office and stood in the center of the silent kitchen. My eyes drifted past the massive stone ovens and the commercial mixers, landing directly on the old industrial dough proofer in the far corner. The heavy cabinet had been bothering me for days. The bright, shiny screw securing the bottom back panel was a glaring anomaly against the decades of accumulated grime and grease. Gary had offered me cash to haul it away. Brenda had repeatedly demanded I throw it out. I walked over to the toolbox hanging near the back exit and pulled out a simple flathead screwdriver. I knelt on the cold tile floor and positioned the tool into the shiny new screw. It turned smoothly, offering absolutely no resistance. I removed it, then carefully wedged the flat metal edge under the panel and popped the steel plate loose. Behind the panel, tucked neatly beside the internal heating element, was a small, heavy object tightly wrapped in brown wax baking paper. I pulled it out, my hands remarkably steady. I peeled back the stiff wax paper to reveal a flat brass key. It was a standard safe deposit box key, stamped with the logo of the major commercial bank located just 3 blocks down the street. Engraved into the brass was the box number 7249. Walter had literally hidden the key to his legacy inside the machine designed to make bread rise. It was an incredibly poetic, entirely brilliant move. He knew Brenda and Gary viewed the bakery equipment as worthless junk. He knew they would never look twice at an aging proofing cabinet. I did not waste a single second. I slipped the brass key into my coat pocket, grabbed my purse, and walked out of the bakery, locking the heavy deadbolt behind me. The harsh Boston wind bit at my face as I walked the 3 blocks to the commercial bank. I presented my identification to the vault manager. Because Walter had smartly listed me as a registered co-signer on the box 2 years ago, the account had not been frozen upon his death. The manager did not ask any questions. He simply checked my signature against his file, nodded politely, and escorted me deep into the secure, temperature-controlled vault. He inserted his master key. I inserted the brass key I had found behind the heating element. The heavy metal door clicked open smoothly. Inside the long, narrow box sat a single, thick manila envelope bearing the seal of Patricia Vance's law firm. I pulled the envelope out, feeling the heavy weight of the thick legal parchment resting in my hands. I walked into the vault. I sat in a private viewing room at the bank, carefully breaking the seal on the heavy envelope. Inside was a massive stack of legal documents. The header on the primary document made my heart stop completely. It did not say Last Will and Testament. It read Irrevocable Trust Agreement of Walter Family Commercial Holdings. To fully grasp the absolute magnitude of what Walter had done, you must understand a fundamental piece of estate law. When an elderly parent begins to fail, greedy relatives often rush to secure a power of attorney. A standard POA grants someone the right to manage personal bank accounts and sell personal assets. That is exactly what Gary had forged to sell the building. But an irrevocable trust is an entirely different armor. 2 years ago, while he was completely lucid, Walter legally transferred the physical building, the business name, and every single proprietary recipe out of his own personal name and directly into the trust. From that exact moment forward, Walter did not legally own the bakery. The trust owned it, and because it was irrevocable, the terms could not be altered, modified, or dissolved, even by Walter himself. Most importantly, a power of attorney cannot touch an irrevocable trust. APOA only governs personal property. Therefore, the forged document Gary and Brenda used to initiate the public auction was completely legally impotent. Brenda had confidently sold an intellectual property she did not own. And Gary had orchestrated the auction of a building that belonged to a highly protected legal entity. I read the specific terms of the trust carefully. The document explicitly named me as the sole primary beneficiary and managing trustee, with one strict condition. I had to maintain the bakery as an operational business for a minimum of 10 years, and I was strictly forbidden from selling the land to corporate housing developers. Walter had not just handed me a building, he had legally bound me to protect the neighborhood. I leaned back in the plush leather chair of the viewing room. The brilliance of Walter's strategy was stunning. He knew Brenda would scour his apartment for a regular will. He knew Gary would try to force a quick sale. By using an irrevocable trust, Walter had constructed an invisible fortress around the property that they could not breach, even with forged signatures. The sale they initiated was totally invalid, but because my LLC had purchased the property with clean funds, I now controlled the asset from both sides of the legal spectrum. The bakery was completely safe. I continued reading through the thick stack of legal parchment, moving past the standard operational clauses and the property descriptions. Towards the very back of the trust document, under a section titled Fiduciary Restrictions and Penalties, I found the specific legal mechanism that would completely destroy Brenda and Gary. It was an aggressively worded anti-self-dealing clause. In standard estate planning, these clauses are designed to prevent family members from abusing their proximity to an elderly relative. Walter and his attorney, Patricia Vance, had drafted a remarkably vicious version of this rule. The clause explicitly stated that if any family member attempted to use a power of attorney, medical guardianship, or any fraudulent representation to transfer assets out of the trust for their own personal enrichment, they would instantly trigger a severe legal penalty. They would completely forfeit their right to any remaining liquid cash in Walter's personal estate. Furthermore, they would be held personally liable for all legal fees incurred by the trust to reverse their fraudulent actions. I sat perfectly still, processing the magnitude of the weapon Walter had handed me. Brenda had already drained Walter's personal accounts by paying herself an unjustified $8,000 monthly caregiving fee. Gary had actively used his real estate firm's resources to set up a shell company, hoping to steal $1 million in profit from the gentrification wave. They had both engaged in massive, undeniable self-dealing. They thought the public auction was their grand finish line. They believed they had outsmarted the system, bypassed probate court, and secured their financial futures. They did not realize they had forcefully walked directly into a heavily armed legal snare. By attempting to execute the forged POA, they had officially triggered the anti-self-dealing clause. They were not just going to lose the bakery building. They were going to lose the $75,000 Brenda took from the coffee chain. They were going to lose the right to any leftover cash in the estate. And they were going to pay my attorney's fees to enforce it. I did not feel a rush of manic joy. I felt a deep, profound sense of order. This was not about revenge in the emotional, screaming sense. This was about mathematical and legal consequence. You cannot attempt to steal a multi-million-dollar legacy and expect the universe to simply look the other way. Sometimes, the universe requires a highly detailed legal filing. I placed the documents back into the envelope. The blade was perfectly sharp. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived crisp and grey in Boston. I stood in my tiny rented apartment above the laundromat, drinking a cup of dark roast coffee, methodically preparing for the dinner. I did not rehearse any angry speeches in the mirror. I did not practice crying or shouting. I treated the upcoming confrontation exactly like a complex corporate audit. You do not argue with a bad spreadsheet. You simply present the correct numbers. I laid a slim, black leather briefcase on my small kitchen table and began to carefully load the ammunition. First, I placed the official county deed showing that Iron Crust Holdings, LLC, was the sole registered owner of the bakery property, secured by a $500,000 to $20,000 payment. Second, I slid in the thick, certified copy of the irrevocable trust agreement, clearly showing the notary stamp from 2 years prior, proving the building was never Brenda's to sell. Third, I added the forensic analysis of the forged power of attorney, highlighting the retired notary seal and the digitally cloned signature. Fourth, I included the corporate registry printouts, proving that Gary's credit card had funded the shell company, Harbour Horizon Developments, directly linking him to the manipulated auction. Finally, I placed the copied contract showing Brenda's illegal sale of the intellectual property and recipes for $75,000. Every single piece of paper was a nail in their financial coffins. I snapped the briefcase shut. Are you ready for the quietest, most devastating confrontation? Drop a "ready" in the comments if you're still with me. I walked over to my small closet and pulled out a simple, dark green tailored dress. It was professional, understated, and completely unbothered. I brushed my hair, checked my reflection, and made sure there was absolutely no trace of anxiety on my face. Brenda and Megan wanted a broken, defeated woman to show up at their dinner table so they could offer her fake pity and a legally binding waiver. I was going to give them a managing trustee armed with federal statutes. I picked up the black leather briefcase, feeling its reassuring weight. I grabbed a beautifully baked loaf of sourdough bread to offer as a polite hostess gift. Then I locked the door to my small apartment and walked out into the freezing November wind. I grabbed my car keys. I parked my 10-year-old sedan behind Gary's brand new luxury SUV in Brenda's expansive circular driveway. The house was heavily decorated for the holidays, glowing with warm, inviting lights that completely masked the toxic reality inside. I walked up the stone steps, carrying my freshly baked sourdough loaf in one hand and my slim black briefcase in the other. Brenda opened the door before I even knocked, pulling me into a suffocating, perfume-heavy hug. "Collins, darling, you look so comfortable," Brenda said, her eyes briefly scanning my simple tailored dress. Come in. We are just about to sit down." I handed her the bread. She took it with a tight smile and immediately handed it off to a hired caterer, as if holding carbohydrates might somehow damage her manicured hands. I walked into the massive formal dining room. Gary was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, pouring himself a generous glass of imported red wine. Megan was hovering near the center of the table, meticulously adjusting a massive, gaudy floral centerpiece. I watched her carefully. She casually leaned her smartphone against a heavy crystal vase. The camera lens pointed directly at the empty chair reserved for me. The tiny green light on her screen indicated the camera was actively recording. She was live streaming. Megan wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to frame herself as the grieving, peacemaking relative dealing with a bitter, greedy cousin who was holding a grudge over a bakery sale. She wanted her online followers to watch me break down, maybe throw a glass of water, or storm out in tears. I took my designated seat directly in the crosshairs of the camera lens. I placed my black briefcase flat on the floor beside my chair. The catered turkey was served. The wine was poured. Brenda initiated a nauseatingly fake toast to family unity and moving forward. I took a small sip of my water and waited. I knew the exact moment she would make her move. Right before the dessert plates were cleared. Brenda sighed deeply and reached into a folder resting on the sideboard. She pulled out a stapled document and slid it gently across the polished wood toward me. "Collins, sweetheart," Brenda began, her voice dripping with artificial maternal concern. "We know this transition has been terribly hard on you, losing Walter, losing your little job, but it is time to heal. Gary had his attorney draft a simple family settlement agreement. It just formally wraps up the estate sale and ensures there is no lingering bad blood or unnecessary legal confusion down the road. If you sign it, we are even willing to gift you a small severance package from the auction proceeds, just to help you get back on your feet." I looked down at the document. It was 3 pages long, a standard liability waiver mixed with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. It required me to formally validate the fraudulent power of attorney and explicitly bless the auction sale. I did not reach for the pen she offered. The camera was watching. Brenda smiled encouragingly, tapping the silver pen against the polished mahogany table. Gary took another slow sip of his wine, watching me with the smug confidence of a predator who believes the trap has finally snapped shut. Megan subtly adjusted her posture, ensuring her best angle was captured by the hidden phone camera broadcasting to her followers. I did not touch the silver pen. I did not look at the document. I looked directly into Brenda's perfectly made-up face. "Why does a family Thanksgiving dinner require a 3-page legal liability waiver?" I asked. My voice was completely level, the exact tone I use when negotiating bulk flour prices with wholesale vendors. Brenda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "It is just standard procedure, Collins, to protect the family, to ensure we all agree that Walter's wishes were properly carried out during the sale." I reached down and lifted my slim black briefcase onto my lap. I snapped the twin brass locks open. The sharp clicks echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. "Walter's wishes," I repeated calmly. "Let us talk about Walter's wishes, Brenda." I pulled out the first stack of papers. They were the certified bank statements I had recovered from Walter's personal checking account. I placed them on the table, turning them so Brenda could clearly see the highlighted lines. "You isolated him in that facility for 10 months, I said, my voice carrying no malice, only factual certainty. "You told the neighborhood you were sacrificing your life to care for him, yet, on the first of every single month, you drafted an $8,000 transfer directly into your personal account. You charged your dying father $80,000 in unapproved caregiving fees, while I paid the bakery's commercial property taxes out of my own pocket." Gary shifted uncomfortably in his heavy wooden chair. Brenda's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. "How dare you?" she hissed, abandoning the sweet maternal tone entirely. "I managed his care. I earned that money. You earned nothing." I replied smoothly. I reached into the briefcase again. I pulled out the color copies of the commercial licensing agreement. I placed the document directly over the bank statements. "Just like you earned nothing from selling his proprietary sourdough recipe, the bakery logo, and the customer mailing list to a corporate coffee chain for an upfront cash payment of $75,000, a payment that cleared exactly 3 days before Megan paid off her Platinum American Express card. Megan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She instinctively glanced at the floral centerpiece, where her phone was actively broadcasting the entire confrontation to the internet. Her digital audience was no longer watching a bitter baker throw a tantrum. They were watching a calculated financial execution. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her. I simply let the undeniable weight of the financial documents speak for me. Brenda stared at the licensing agreement, her mouth opening and closing silently. She had absolutely no idea how I had obtained the heavily guarded corporate contract. The room was freezing. Gary finally decided to intervene. He slammed his wine glass down, a dark scowl twisting his features. He realized the situation was rapidly spiraling out of Brenda's control, so he tried to use his usual aggressive intimidation tactics. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," Gary barked, pointing a thick finger across the table. "You illegally snooped through private mail. That is a federal offense. It does not matter what Brenda did. The building is officially sold. The public auction cleared. You have absolutely no legal standing here." I turned my attention away from Brenda and focused entirely on Gary. I did not flinch at his raised voice. I simply reached into the black briefcase for the third time. I pulled out the thick, certified copy of the irrevocable trust agreement bearing Patricia Vance's legal seal. I placed it gently on the table. The building was not sold. "Gary," I said softly, "because Brenda never had the legal right to sell it. 2 years ago, Walter transferred the entire property, the brand, and all intellectual rights into an irrevocable trust. Her forged power of attorney is a legally useless piece of paper. The auction you forced was completely fraudulent." Gary's face turned the color of wet ash. But I was not finished. The true masterpiece of this confrontation was not just exposing their crimes against me, it was exposing their crimes against each other. I pulled out the final stack of documents, the corporate registry printouts for Harbor Horizon Developments. I slid them across the table, not toward Gary, but directly toward Brenda. "You should read those, Brenda," I instructed calmly. Brenda, trembling slightly, looked down at the papers. "What is this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "That is the corporate shell company that aggressively bid the bakery up to $480,000 at the auction," I explained, watching the realization slowly dawn on her face. "Notice the registered business address. Notice the credit card number used to pay the state filing fees. Gary did not set up the auction to help you, Brenda. He set it up to buy the building cheaply through his own fake company. He was going to give you a tiny cut of the auction price, then flip the newly rezoned property to his commercial developers for over $1.5 million. He was stealing from you." I watched the precise moment the trust between them shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Thieves never truly share. They merely tolerate each other until a better opportunity arises. Gary had found his opportunity, and I had just handed Brenda the receipt. She slowly looked up from the documents, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She stared at her brother. The alliance of greed fractured instantly. Gary had intended to cheat his own sister out of $1 million, and now the undeniable proof was resting next to the gravy boat. The betrayal was absolute. The Thanksgiving dining room erupted into sheer chaos, but I remained perfectly still in my chair. Brenda lunged out of her seat, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face. She grabbed the corporate registry documents and shoved them directly into Gary's chest. "You lying, scheming bastard!" Brenda screamed, completely forgetting her refined neighborhood persona. "You told me the developers backed out. You told me a quick auction was our only viable option. You were going to steal $1 million from your own family." Gary panicked. The cool, calculating real estate broker completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered man. He knew he was facing massive fraud charges if this escalated, and he needed Brenda to maintain the lie about the power of attorney to protect them both. He grabbed Brenda by the arm and physically dragged her toward the adjoining living room, desperate to keep the conversation private. He completely forgot about Megan. He completely forgot about the smartphone propped against the floral centerpiece, its tiny green light still glowing, actively broadcasting audio to dozens of local viewers. "Shut up!" "Brenda, keep your voice down," Gary hissed aggressively, but in his blind panic, his voice carried clearly across the quiet dining room. "We have to stick to the story. If you turn on me, we both go to federal prison. You know damn well Walter never signed that power of attorney. You forged it." I looked at Megan. All the color had drained from her young, arrogant face. She stared at her phone in absolute horror, realizing her uncle had just loudly confessed to felony forgery on a live internet broadcast. Viewers were already screen recording the feed. The digital footprint was permanently cemented into the public domain. The weapon they intended to use to humiliate me had just become the primary exhibit in their criminal prosecution. I did not say another word. I did not gloat. I did not demand an apology. Because an apology from a thief is entirely worthless. I simply reached across the table, gathered my certified trust documents, the bank statements, and the corporate records, and placed them neatly back into my slim black briefcase. I stood up from the table. I heard Brenda start sobbing hysterically in the other room, followed by the sound of breaking glass. It was the sound of a carefully constructed illusion collapsing under its own corrupt weight. I did not look back. I did not stop to listen to the destruction. My grandfather's legacy was secured, protected by the exact legal shield he had designed. I had walked into a trap and simply dismantled it by refusing to play their emotional games. I walked down the hallway, opened the heavy oak front door, and stepped out into the freezing Boston evening. I breathed in the sharp, clean air. I walked away clean. If you think greedy people surrender simply because they are caught, you have never dealt with a cornered narcissist. By Monday morning, Gary's desperation had morphed into a vicious, reckless counterattack. I was standing in the bakery kitchen, wiping down the stainless steel counters, when an urgent email arrived from the county escrow office, accompanied by a formal letter from a high-priced downtown litigation firm. Gary had hired an aggressive lawyer to file an emergency injunction. They officially froze the $520,000 sitting in the escrow account. The legal letter accused my LLC, Iron Crust Holdings, of severe market manipulation, illegal insider trading, and deliberate corporate sabotage. Gary's lawyer claimed I had intentionally colluded with Henderson to artificially lower the bakery's revenue projections before the auction to scare off legitimate buyers. The title insurance company immediately flagged the transaction, refusing to transfer the commercial deed into my name until the sudden legal dispute was formally resolved. I was locked out of my own purchase. The funds were frozen. I still had vendors to pay and a bakery to rebuild. This was Gary's final, desperate attempt to bankrupt me through prolonged litigation. He wanted to bleed me dry in legal fees until I surrendered the trust. I did not panic. I did not call his lawyer to negotiate. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at Walter's wooden desk. I opened my laptop and drafted a single, highly precise email addressed directly to Gary's expensive litigation attorney. I did not type an emotional defense. I simply attached 3 files. Attachment 1. The certified irrevocable trust document, highlighting the anti-self-dealing clause that explicitly stripped all inheritance rights from any family member who used forged documents to manipulate trust assets. The clause explicitly dictated that Gary would personally owe my attorney fees for this exact stunt. Attachment 2. The forensic handwriting analysis proving the power of attorney was a digital clone. Attachment 3. The screen-recorded video from Meghan's Thanksgiving livestream, clearly featuring Gary screaming his full confession about the forged signature. I added one single sentence to the body of the email. If this frivolous injunction is not completely withdrawn within exactly 2 hours, these attachments will be formally submitted to the District Attorney's Fraud Division. I hit send. I did not pace the floor. I drank my coffee and reviewed the new pastry menu. I later learned his expensive attorney dropped him as a client the exact second he watched the live stream video, refusing to be an accomplice to a documented federal crime. Exactly 42 minutes later, my phone pinged. It was an official notification from the county. The emergency injunction had been immediately withdrawn. The escrow funds were officially cleared for disbursement. The title was free. The counterattack had collapsed instantly under the crushing weight of undeniable proof. The deed was secured. The collapse of a corrupt alliance does not happen with a loud explosion. It happens like a row of perfectly aligned dominoes falling in absolute silence. Once the emergency injunction was formally dismissed, the county released the frozen $500,000 to $20,000 from the escrow account because my LLC owned the building, and I was the primary beneficiary of the trust that owned the land. The capital was legally routed back into my control as a designated renovation fund. I had essentially paid myself to secure the property, bypassing their greedy hands completely. Gary did not escape quietly into the night. When the State Real Estate Commission received an anonymous, highly detailed package containing the corporate registry of Harbour Horizon Developments and the forensic analysis of the forged power of attorney, they immediately suspended his broker's license. He is currently under a massive federal investigation for commercial real estate fraud. The lucrative luxury apartment developers, terrified of the toxic public relations disaster, completely severed all ties with him. Gary's prestigious downtown office is now empty, his reputation completely destroyed by his own arrogant greed. Brenda's fate was arguably much worse because she had to face a relentless corporate legal team. The national coffee chain did not care about our family drama. They only cared that they had paid $75,000 for intellectual property that the seller did not legally own. When the irrevocable trust was publicly validated, the corporate lawyers immediately filed a brutal civil lawsuit against Brenda for felony wire fraud and breach of contract. They demanded their money back immediately, plus extensive legal damages. Brenda did not have the money. She had already spent a massive portion of it paying off Meghan's exorbitant credit card debts. to avoid facing potential jail time for fraud. Brenda was forced to take out a high-interest secondary mortgage on her own suburban home. The wealthy, composed neighborhood matriarch was suddenly exposed as a desperate, debt-ridden fraudster. Megan's imaginary luxury lifestyle evaporated overnight. Without her mother's stolen funds to support her superficial habits, her boutique clothing brand collapsed before it even officially launched. The last I heard from the neighborhood gossip. Megan was quietly selling her designer handbags on internet resale forums just to make her minimum car payments. I did not celebrate their financial ruin. I did not drive past their houses to gloat. I simply watched the legal process handle the mess they had eagerly created for themselves. They had spent months digging a deep, dark pit for me, assuming I would just quietly fall in. I simply stepped aside and watched gravity do the rest. I took no responsibility for their misery because I had not forged a single document. I had not stolen a single dime. I only presented the absolute truth. The dominoes fell perfectly. A week after the legal dust finally settled, I found myself sitting alone in the bakery kitchen. The heavy renovations were scheduled to begin the next morning. The room was perfectly quiet, smelling faintly of old flour and polished wood. I sat at Walter's vintage wooden desk, the single yellow desk lamp casting a warm circle of light across the smooth surface. I reached into my bag and pulled out the heavy manila envelope I had recovered from the bank vault. Tucked at the very bottom, beneath the dense pages of the irrevocable trust, was a much smaller, personal envelope. My name was written across the front in Walter's sharp, familiar cursive. I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of thick stationery. If you are reading this, Collins, it means the worst has happened. It means my children let their greed overshadow their humanity, and you had to use the shield I built for you. I am deeply sorry that I left you to fight this battle alone. For years, I watched Brenda dismiss you. I watched Gary talk down to you. My greatest regret is that I kept the peace when I should have defended you out loud. I took a slow, deep breath, tracing my fingers over the blue ink. I know you always felt like you were standing on the absolute edge of this family. I know you felt like a quiet outsider doing the heavy lifting while everyone else took the credit. But I need you to understand something crucial. I did not leave this bakery to you simply because we share the same blood. Blood is an accident of birth. I chose you because every single morning, when the city was dark and nobody was watching, you still turned on the ovens. You stayed. The words blurred slightly as my eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming validation. Do not let them make you feel small, Collins. Do not fight their loud lies with more shouting. Let the documents speak. Let your hard work stand as your permanent testament. The foundation of this place does not belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who stayed to sweep the flour. It belongs to you. I folded the letter carefully, matching the original creases, and placed it back into its envelope. For my entire life, I had desperately craved validation from a family that was fundamentally incapable of giving it. I realized in that quiet kitchen that I never needed Brenda's approval or Gary's respect. The only person whose opinion actually mattered had seen my quiet dedication all along. He had armed me from beyond the grave, proving that genuine love is measured in protective actions, not empty holiday toasts. I finally belonged completely. 6 months later, the spring sun washed over the cobblestone streets of Boston. the heavy construction tarps were finally pulled down, revealing the beautifully restored storefront of Walter's legacy bakery. We had expanded the seating area, polished the original exposed brick, and installed brand new display cases that gleamed in the morning light. But the soul of the kitchen remained exactly the same. I stood behind the marble counter at 5 a.m, listening to the rhythmic, comforting hum of the commercial mixers, the smell of fresh sourdough, melting butter, and rich, dark espresso filled the entire room. It was the smell of absolute freedom. The back door swung open, and Henderson walked in wearing a pristine white chef's coat. I had formally rehired him as the executive head baker with a substantial raise and full benefits. He walked over to the old industrial dough proofer in the corner, patting the metal casing affectionately before checking the internal humidity. He looked at me across the kitchen, his eyes crinkling into a deep, genuine smile. We did not need to discuss the nightmare of the past winter. The warm ovens spoke for themselves. At exactly 7 o'clock, a massive crowd of local neighbours gathered on the sidewalk. They were the people who had supported us, the regulars who deeply valued community heritage over sterile luxury condos. I stepped out onto the front porch, holding a bright red ribbon and a pair of large silver scissors. I did not cut the ribbon myself. I handed the heavy scissors to Henderson. He deserved the honour just as much as I did. He snipped the ribbon, and the crowd erupted into genuine, joyful applause. As I smiled and welcomed the first wave of customers inside, I noticed a familiar figure standing across the street, partially hidden behind a street lamp. It was Megan. She was holding a cheap paper coffee cup from a generic chain store, wearing a plain, unbranded jacket. She looked completely exhausted, watching the thriving business she had eagerly tried to destroy. She caught my eye. For a brief second, the distance between us felt immense. She was expecting me to glare at her, to offer a smug smile of absolute victory, or perhaps to walk over and humiliate her in public. That is exactly what she would have done if our positions were reversed. I did none of those things. I simply broke eye contact, turned my back to the street, and walked into the warm, bustling bakery to serve my waiting customers. She was no longer a part of my narrative. She was just a stranger standing on the sidewalk. I went back inside. We are often conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable, absolute bond. Society tells us that we must endlessly forgive toxic behavior, financial abuse, and emotional manipulation simply because we share a common last name. But staying silent in the face of continuous disrespect does not actually keep the peace. It only normalizes your own suffering. The profits from Walter's legacy bakery are stronger than ever, but I am not hoarding the capital. I used a significant portion of our first quarter revenue to establish the Walter Craft Scholarship. We actively partner with local high schools to bring in teenagers from difficult backgrounds, teaching them the precise science of baking and the absolute value of honest labour. I am building a new family inside those kitchen walls. A family chosen by mutual respect and shared dedication, rather than assigned by genetic obligation. Sitting in the bakery now, listening to the laughter of my young apprentices and the steady hum of the ovens, I finally understand what Walter was trying to teach me. True justice does not require a screaming match at a dinner table. It does not require you to lower your own standards to fight in the mud with people who lack integrity. True justice is incredibly quiet. It is found in airtight documents, precise financial ledgers, and the undeniable reality of who shows up to do the hard work when the cameras are turned off. Legacy is not simply what you passively inherit through a legal will. Legacy is what you are willing to fiercely protect with your own sweat and dignity. If my story has ever made you realize that walking away from a toxic table is sometimes the biggest victory of all, do me a favor. Leave a comment below saying, "I protect my own." It helps me know that this message is reaching the people who truly need to hear it. Do not let anyone convince you that your quiet dedication is a weakness. Gather your facts, build your own fortress, and when the greedy hands finally reach for what is yours, let the paper speak. Thank you so much for spending your time with Calm Drama Stories today. Please hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story, and share this video with someone who might be struggling to find their own voice. Protect what matters most.